Hello and welcome to After Order, a new series from Macrodose in collaboration with the Alameda Institute. Launched in 2023, Alameda brings together a global network of thinkers and activists across 5 continents. Through collective research and dialogue, the Institute aims to confront some of the most pressing political questions of our time. The title of this series comes from Alameda's After Order research project, which begins with a simple but unsettling proposition that we may no longer just be living through an interregnum between stable systems, but have instead entered a period defined by recurring crises, a time after stable orders. Across politics, economics, and technology, the ground seems to be shifting, from the rise of new authoritarian movements to the restructuring of global trade, from new wars to the growing power of non-state actors, from mafias and evangelical networks to tech oligarchs. Power today is more fragmented, contested, and unstable than it has been since the end of the Cold War. Through conversations with leading thinkers from around the world, this series asks a basic question. Where does power actually lie in an age of disorder? And what new pathways, what new Alamedas might lead us towards something better? In today's episode, I'm joined by Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff to discuss their new book, Muskism, a guide for the perplexed. Using Elon Musk as a kind of avatar for our age, Quinn and Ben unpack the emerging logic of what they call Muskism, the playbook of a new post-liberal political economy. By tracing the forces that shaped Musk himself, apartheid-era South Africa to Silicon Valley, Tesla and SpaceX to social media and crypto, the book identifies a set of recurring motifs that increasingly define our crisis-ridden moment. Muskism, they argue, speaks a language of civilizational emergency to justify a particular vision of the future. A future where the technocrat is king, where private power leans heavily on the state despite claiming to transcend it, and where salvation is reserved for a select few elites. So what does Muskism tell us about the world after order? So Quinn, Ben, welcome to After Order.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
I wanted to start with the big, obvious question. We're calling this series After Order because it's about what happens to the world when the forms of order, the institutions, the systems that we have, that have kind of kept everything stable one way or the other for decades now, start to fall apart. And that would be associated with something that often gets called neoliberalism and the end of neoliberalism. So the big one to start with, I suppose, for both of you is, what would you mean when you talk about neoliberalism?
Well, I think the way it relates to what we're going to talk about today connects to 2 definitions of neoliberalism. One would be thinking of it as a kind of ideological doctrine, that preaches an idea of individual freedom, choice, and those things being realizable within a state system that keeps democratic societies from interfering too much with certain ground rules of private property, competition, and so on, associated with people like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and so on. The other way of thinking about neoliberalism would be as a kind of a series of processes, including, the ever greater dependency on financial systems for the reproduction of societies, moves towards deindustrialization, global outsourcing, deregulation. And I think it's worth mentioning those things at the top because the way we talk about Musk, I think, relates a lot to the second in the sense that Musk is a product of the world that neoliberalism created, but much less obviously connects to the first, because as we'll discuss, the principles of Muskism often seem to not only have little in common with even the core ideas of individual choice and freedom, but the very idea of being able to understand something by, connecting texts from one to the other and influence through think tanks and rolled out through policy is very different from the way we understand Muskism in this book and how we understand the kind of dominant ideology of digital capitalism.
Just going to add that I think our reason for doing this project is precisely to try to answer this question, or at least give us a new vantage point on it, which is, I think it's widely understood that we're after neoliberalism, we're after post-Fordism, whatever you want to call the period of global capitalism between the 1970s and the present. I think what's less clear is how do we define the current moment? We've been reading and influenced by various efforts to do so through concepts like techno-feudalism, through some accounting of the role of digital capitalism. Muskism is our provisional answer to that question. We think it's actually a different way of telling the story of the last 40 years that hopefully gives us some handholds on the current period of crisis and where it might be going.
you use Elon Musk as a kind of figure to tell the story. The book is sort of his, not entirely his life story, but it's a sort of series of things that he does that gradually build up this picture. And you draw the direct parallel, you just mentioned it yourself, with somebody else, a well-known car manufacturer, Henry Ford, who also gave his name to, Fordism, which we'd all now understand as this. Well, following actually Antonio Gramsci, I suppose, is probably the person I can think of first to really sort of systematically think about this as a system of, yes, mass production in your Fordist factory, but also bigger than that, a system of organizing society, a system of how society thinks about itself, of mass consumption, of a particular kind of standards of life, a particular way of life, all combined in this bigger concept of Fordism. And I think, is it fair to say you're trying to do something similar with Muskism, that this isn't just about Elon Musk himself or his particular stated beliefs, but there's actually a reorganization of society that's attached to this?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, the term Fordism was coined actually exactly 100 years ago by a German economist. And he referred to it, among other things, as a dictatorship of technical reason. And by doing so, he wasn't claiming that Henry Ford himself had come to a series of principles or was acting in some premeditated way. But as you say, that if one takes the assembly line and mass production on the model he describes, then an entire reorganization of society needs to follow to deliver the workers into the factory in healthy enough condition to be able to do their jobs, to anchor what had been often unruly class struggle and social movement and turn it into something regulated by collective bargaining agreements and a certain degree of labor peace. So from the 1920s through especially the French regulation school efforts of the 1970s, at a moment when Fordism seemed to be dissolving, people have tried to take these figures and then extrapolate something larger about the social system by investigating them more closely. Where exactly we were inspired by that was to ask, what is the mode of regulation that happens outside of the factory? How is the disruptive effects of any new production process stabilized in the world that Musk proposes? What is, in short, the social contract that Musk is offering? So we use that idea of Muskism, like Fordism, as kind of an analytic, but also kind of, as has been suggested to us, as a kind of way of strategizing too. Because if you can understand more broadly how it is that this erratic moron has become the most highly rewarded person in the current global economy, then maybe you can understand better, the vulnerabilities within the system that he's helped create.
So what is the social contract? Because to me, the social contract under Fordism is something that sort of died a death in this country a while ago. It's quite clear what you're going to get, a big welfare state and a colour television, and your television's going to be better this time next year than it was, and that's what you're going to have for a long period of time. Neoliberalism did at least part of that, which is, you have a really good plasma TV in your house, right? And this is part of the deal. What does Muskism offer?
Well, this is where the difficulty comes in, which is that there actually isn't a very good social contract under Muskism. As you mentioned, both Fordism and post-Fordism do attempt to offer some mechanism for securing consent, for manufacturing legitimacy, either in the case of a relatively stable wage through industrial work on Fordism, or with post-Fordism, as you alluded to, a kind of wider differentiation of consumer goods, but also asset price inflation, right? People particularly understood to be homeowners and retail investors, and also through their pension funds, are benefiting in some form from rising prices of financial assets. Muskism, in contrast, doesn't appear to have a kind of broader appeal of those kinds, but we actually take that as symptomatic, as telling us something about Muskism as a system, as a political economic paradigm, which is that it does not think about consent or legitimacy as necessary terms. And that's precisely because it does not start from the individual, it starts from the computer. And if you start from the computer and think that everything, all of human reality, is downstream of the computer, then politics is actually not about securing consent. It's not about trying to make an arrangement to purchase social peace of a kind. It's actually about seizing control of the correct computers, reprogramming the code base, and letting the effects proliferate downstream. That, I think, is a very helpful concept because it helps make sense not only of certain passages in Musk's own life, such as Doge, such as, in our argument, the broader turn to the right, his transformation of Twitter, and so forth. But I think, again, to step back from the figure of Musk himself, also tells us something broader about our social reality, because there is, as is often the case in Musk's twists and turns, a kernel of truth here about the extent to which our lives, and in particular our political lives, have become so entangled with digitization.
So as Ben said, if the post-Fordist form of buying legitimacy and consent was in part through the creation of systems of financial support, which one could then, in a responsibilized way, either succeed or fail inside of, then there's certain core ways in which Muskism continues that. And I'll give you a very concrete example. One of the top 10 owners of Tesla stock is the Norwegian Oil Fund. And at the end of last year, the Ethics Council of the Norwegian Oil Fund made the determination that because of the complicity of Silicon Valley with Israel and the conduct of its genocide, the Norwegian Oil Fund needed to divest from Silicon Valley big tech stocks. Jens Stoltenberg stepped in immediately and threatened the dissolution of the Ethics Council if that were to be carried out. The grounds on which he did that was that the future of the Norwegian welfare state, as he put it, was the primary goal of the fiduciary status of the Norwegian Oil Fund. And to divest from Silicon Valley would be to threaten the future of the Norwegian welfare state. So this is the kind of dependency that we are familiar with in the era of asset manager capitalism and institutional investors and market-driven pension funds. In some ways, Musk continues that. In a couple of other ways, he gestures at something that's new that can be either seen as a fragility or a kind of terrifying feature. It could be seen as a weakness in the sense that when he enters the White House and takes the approach that Ben just laid out, treats the government as just a bunch of computers, as he famously called it, speaking to Ted Cruz. Then he found out fairly quickly that the government is something more than a bunch of computers. Actually, if you want to even try to cut, as he said, $2 trillion from the federal budget, you get very quickly to Medicare, which is the basic provision of health insurance to the poorest Americans, and to Social Security, which people have paid into throughout their working lives and have a very good reason to expect a payout of on retirement. As soon as he touched that third rail of politics, all hell broke loose. That's when the town halls filled up. That's when his poll numbers started to tank. And that's when he kind of needed to leave government with his tail between his legs, ultimately actually adding to the federal deficit after the One Big Beautiful Bill Act introduced more tax cuts for the very wealthy. So you could look at that and say, aha, Muskism is weak. He thinks people are computers. They're not. Old-fashioned democracy is still alive. The other way of looking at it, though, is to ask, what it meant that people within the MAGA coalition, using Musk as kind of their bulldog, felt that they could do something like start carving away at what has long been seen as the holy cow of the American biopolitical settlement, which is these very slim but necessary forms of survival infrastructure. What does it mean when you feel like you can chop away at those? It might mean, thinking like the regulation theorists, that you actually have no fear of backlash, or that the social contract actually already has been thinned out to the point of non-existence. Thus, you would feel no fear that there would be, insurgent social movements that would punish you for this act. So maybe that form of consent and legitimacy that one looks for in the case of a Fordist or a post-Fordist arrangement is no longer necessary, that we've advanced far enough down the road of what we call Muskism that has been kind of thinned out to the point of disappearance.
I mean, you preempted slightly my next question, which is, well, you may not believe that consent is necessary. This doesn't, in fact, get rid of the problem of consent, right? That we haven't had any version of capitalism, even to think about it that far, where consent has not been a sort of primary thing it searches for in one way or the other. At least any version of capitalism that has any sort of continued expansive existence. You take the European state system, it has a pretty solid version of consent built around a welfare state, the provision of certain kinds of consumer goods over a long period of time. Neoliberalism never seriously gets rid of that. And it doesn't seriously challenge, as you say, the sort of fairly minimal by European standards, but nonetheless real parts of the welfare state that existed in the US in particular. It was never able to get rid of that. And at certain points, there's a direct relationship. And New Labour is almost the classic example of neoliberalism on one side, actually deliberately welded onto social democracy. Here's a welfare state. Gordon Brown as Chancellor is going to increase spending on the NHS, education. But at the same time, we're going to let the City of London off the leash and you run around and create the greatest credit bubble in history. You have this fusion. of different elements there. Muskism doesn't seem to have that, and this is where the question comes in, that maybe then this starts to explain why the more obvious sort of ideological leanings it has, the way it would talk about, and Musk will talk about, society ought to look like this. We're taking on the woke mind virus, that actually these are the realities we face, and these liberal idiots running everything are trying to convince you otherwise. It's like, it's very sort of overtly ideological and political approach to these sorts of problems, in a way that the sort of passive consent, or the consent that happens without anyone really thinking about it, of Fordism or post-Fordism, it seems to be quite distinct.
Yeah, I'd agree with that characterization, but I think to the extent possible, we're trying to understand Musk as someone who is not perhaps uniquely ideological or uniquely deluded, but someone who is absorbing certain currents in the broader social, political, economic, and indeed technological reality, and reflecting them back to us in remixed and radicalized ways. So in the case of what looks like a relative weakness of Muskism, of the kind of absence of a social contract, and how that's downstream of a kind of cyborg view of reality, there is in fact a quite real development which is occurring as the backdrop to this, which is artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence, when you look at the Silicon Valley leadership class, of which Musk is a member, there is a consensus view that so-called artificial general intelligence will be reached very soon. And this is understood to be the threshold at which an AI system will be sufficiently sophisticated to perform most, if not all, mental tasks. And that this will in turn lead to the elimination of vast numbers of white-collar jobs. And most of the population under this scenario would be defined as surplus to the requirements of accumulation. If you truly believe that such a reality is approaching very soon, as Musk and others in his milieu do, then you imagine a quite post-human future for society in which these questions about consent and legitimacy don't actually look quite as delusional as they might otherwise. Because when we think about, what was it about Fordism that made the capitalist motivated to purchase a degree of social peace, it was class struggle, it was popular mobilization. I think it's fair to say, relative to that period, we don't live in a period of intense class struggle, precisely. But imagine how different that type of popular power might be, and indeed how diminished the opportunities for exercising it in a future, perhaps a near future, in which millions and millions of jobs, and in particular the jobs that were supposed to be the last good jobs, like software engineering, are disappearing. That's already happening in Silicon Valley, thanks to the proliferation of AI coding tools like Claude Code. And it's the firm belief of Musk and others in that world that facility with coding that generative AI has already demonstrated is indeed generalizable to all other kinds of symbolic work.
And I think that given the framing of this series about after order, it's also worth emphasizing that the work that Musk does for us in the book is to help introduce what we see as some of the primary currents that have brought us to this present impasse, or this crisis we find ourselves collectively in. The storylines we have right now for the last 45 years feel inadequate for a couple reasons. One of the things that we feel like needs revision is the idea that we had an era of the Cold War, followed by an era of neoliberal globalism, which somehow ended magically in 2016. And now the pendulum has swung back to an era of nationalism. We think that Musk does a lot of work to insert at least three things that tend to fall off the table. One is the rise to economic peer status, if not superior status, of China in relationship to the United States. Another is the attempt to perform some kind of energy transition without really disrupting the property relationship or the wage relationship or the price system. In other words, green capitalism. And then thirdly, of course, just the overwhelming way in which the growth model of the last 25 years has been built around a few small, enormous tech firms, right? To remind the viewers or listeners, just Apple and Meta account for the same equivalent valuation of the entire German stock exchange. You add a couple more, you have the entire London stock exchange, right? We've never been in an era in modern capitalism where this kind of asymmetry and this disproportionate kind of values persisted. Given the importance of digital capitalism, One of the fourth things that we really feel needs to be placed in that mix is the rollout of generative AI and LLMs since the release of ChatGPT in November 2022. Not necessarily because it changed everyone's lives overnight, but because it changed the growth and investment story overnight. And immediately, the world's investment class, the Silicon Valley class, all align themselves to that North Star. And they have rung up now enough concrete achievements in their own terms that the credibility is actually there. So it helps to sort of zoom out and ask what kind of society was necessary in these different modes of accumulation. Why did Ford want to keep the workers healthy? Well, because he needed healthy, physically able workers inside the factory. Why in the 1990s was there so much emphasis put on higher education, taking on ever larger amounts of often intergenerational debt in the United States to make sure that you got at least a 4-year college or university degree? Because it was an era of knowledge work and the information economy, when it wasn't so far-fetched to say that if the world needed healthy, strapping men in the 1920s, it needed, intellectually agile and nimble, high IQ, quote unquote, knowledge workers, nerds in the 1990s and into the 2000s. Once the paradigm has shifted from the famous announcement from Mark Andreessen in 2011 that software is eating the world, where everything is going into what we call the superset that Musk talks about as early as 1998, to the era that has been now announced as of a tweet last week that AI is eating software. And the number of humans required to operate that once the data centers are built and up and running is shrunk down to a fraction of what preceded it, then it becomes a question of what kind of people are needed for this new mode of accumulation and profit generation. And that, I think, leads you very quickly to this minoritarian approach to governance and the administration of populations that is at the heart of Musk's conceptions.
Although doesn't that contradict with something that you touch on in the book, which is that Musk's well-known obsession with what is politely called pronatalism? It really comes down to sort of breeding and eugenics, really, is actually where he's got to with this. That famously, he thinks that the biggest crisis we face really is the fact that people, and you don't have to look too far to think that he means certain kinds of people, aren't having enough babies right now. If you're saying that the world that he's described and that they are describing of artificial general intelligence really exists, we can come back to how plausible that is, but okay, it really exists, so the surplus population is massive. This looks like an enormous contradiction.
Yes and no. I mean, I think if you look twice at the way he talks about it, it's pronatalist rhetoric without any hint of pronatalist policy, right? In fact, when people talk about techno-fascism or make links between Musk's rhetoric and the fascist rhetoric of the 1930s, one of the things that actually stands out is the absence actually of a positive eugenics inside of techno-fascism, right? I mean, fascism was famously dividing the population into people unworthy of life and people, worthy of reproductive life. Those unworthy of life, we know well, headed for the camps, sterilization. Those worthy of life were given baby bonuses, were given the chance to support women's work from home. The Nazis did a lot to maintain the male breadwinner / man at the battlefield and the woman as primarily mother rather than laborer. They sacrificed a lot to preserve that gendered order. And it did not discriminate necessarily. It was something that, it treated all would-be Aryans alike. Musk has never, in all of his even speculative moments, talked about a way in which the reproductive fecundity of his desired populations should be increased. He's only talked about this in negative terms, that the invaders, the immigrants, the demographic threat coming from non-white populations needs to be reduced, and in fact needs to be, isolated and removed from Western societies. The call for remigration now is nothing less than a call for ethnic roundups and mass deportation. So if given the fact that he has no interest in even proposing some way of bringing up the birth rate for average women, then we have to assume that he sees this as a privatized task, that those with the personal means and the ability to use the very assisted reproductive technologies he used to have, for example, his first 8 children born by IVF, all male, in other words, using prenatal genetic screening to select for male embryos, then for those people, pronatalism all the way, because you're always going to need the top 1% of the bell curve in IQ. But this is not by any appearances something that the average, even quote unquote, desirable white person is going to have at their means.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's always important when looking at Musk's rhetoric to find a way to interpret it the correct way. Perhaps one of the many challenges in writing a book like this is when to take him seriously and how to take him seriously. Because particularly when you think about the volume of his tweets, like just from an analytic perspective, that's a big corpus. So kind of sifting through that and then finding the right analytic lens can be quite tricky. But in the popular discussion, we think of Musk in quite generally pronatalist terms, that it's kind of pitched at the level of the species. When one applies a bit more interpretation, and these days you don't even frankly need much interpretation because he increasingly says this quite explicitly, it's the reproduction of the white species. And, he has undertaken his own efforts toward this end in his own reproductive initiatives. But the fact that even though he expresses a concern for white survival as he sees it, the fact that he is nonetheless not able to accompany that demand with some type of fairly ordinary and straightforward system of social provision that might sustain it is once again symptomatic of this kind of deeper quality of Muskism, of cyborgification, that people are basically programmable, they're non-player characters, and this idea of securing social consent, even modifying people's behavior through political interventions of an old-fashioned sort, no longer apply.
On the one hand, I think we're really trying to offer an alternative to what have been, we think, kind of misleading intellectual-driven histories of the Silicon Valley right. So as often humanists ourselves or book lovers ourselves, it's very tempting to think that the actions and investment strategies even of Silicon Valley leaders are somehow acting in a way that we can intuitively understand. They must have read a certain book. They must have been following the teachings of a certain philosopher. Therefore, all we need to do is sort of reassemble the correct library and read The Sovereign Individual, Ayn Rand, and Curtis Yarvin's, collected works, and we'll now know the real essence of Silicon Valley technology and ideology. We think that capitalists do not, go to the office and work for 12 hours and then come home and read a book and then derive their ideology from the book they read before falling asleep. For one thing, they don't read anything before falling asleep. So it must be the case that, in fact, the ideology is coming from the practice in the workplace. And we need to think about their ideology as being about what lands for investors, what solves problems inside of the workplace, what allows them to unlock government contracts. And in our book, we do our best to come up with some proposals for categories that would help capture that. At the same time, there is kind of the supply side of these hundreds of thousands of tweets that he's putting out into the ether. So what do you make of those, right? On the one hand, it is tempting to treat them as, the truth of Musk's thinking. But to use the example we're talking about here, if you tweet about birth rates and pronatalism for several years and you never say something like paid parental leave, then maybe you're not actually serious about pronatalism. Maybe what you're doing is betraying something we talk about in the book. You're betraying an attitude towards politics, which is that it's actually not about matching policies to people's interests or material needs or desires, but you're treating politics like an interplay of memes. The term that most associates this with Musk is the idea of the woke mind virus. Kind of an absurd term, sounds goofy, but the mind virus is a term coined by Richard Dawkins in the early 1990s, the same person who coins the term meme in the 1976, and he means them quite earnestly, and Musk does too. So to say pronatalism or to express concern about falling birth rates is not to lay out a future political platform, but it's to introduce a meme into the ecosystem of competing memes, which you think will gather people's attention in a way that will be conducive for supporting your interests. So it's to treat the European far right, for example, as a site of potential cybernetic partnership where you can build a kind of momentum through replication, mimesis, that will, you hope, sweep them to power and thus create a more conducive customer-client relationship. So things like the Great Replacement operate in that way as what he sees as more and less efficacious memes by which he can produce an anti-woke mind virus to battle the bad contaminant.
I want to come back to one part of what you're saying, because I think it's a real strength of the book is not starting with the what books do we think Silicon Valley billionaires have been reading, and does this describe what they're doing? You're absolutely right that like these people don't read. Occasionally they write, and maybe we'll come onto the question of Peter Thiel and his relationship to Musk and conflicting versions of what Silicon Valley thinks about itself. But the bit I did want to pick up specifically is that you mentioned the European far right. Elon Musk has developed something of a minor obsession with Britain in particular, as somewhere that he's putting an awful lot. I mean, if you're sitting in Britain, it looks like this, an awful lot of time and effort and attention to poking very specifically at the British government, the wider sort of British liberal class, as he might see it, deliberate interventions and things like the Unite the Kingdom rally and march from last year. This is appearing on a big TV screen and telling everyone that violence is inevitable. That in the middle of riots in 2024, during the summer of 2024, he was there tweeting about how civil war is inevitable. This is deliberate, systematic interventions, picking a fight with Nigel Farage and going to the far right splinter from Reform and saying we must support, I've forgotten their name, Restore UK over. I mean, that's quite a deep cut if you're going into British politics, right? You're going, oh, never mind Nigel Farage, who you might have heard of. You're going somewhere else entirely here. Where has this come from? What's he doing here?
Well, I think it's certainly true that Musk has developed an obsession with both the British and the European far right. One of the ways to understand it is that the United Kingdom and Western Europe are perceived by Musk to be the ancestral home of white civilization. And further, these countries are ones that have really squandered this legacy because they have been too permissive on immigration, that they've embraced multiculturalism, that they have de-Christianized and so forth. And therefore, they're sort of the motherland that on the one hand, figures like Musk, but also others in the American right orient themselves towards, but a motherland that has lost its way. So I think that accounts for this, the peculiar character of the emotion, which is not just one of affiliation and affinity, but also contempt. There's also a kind of abusive relationship towards the United Kingdom and these Western European nations, because there's a sense that this is the source, but it's one that has now been contaminated, been diluted.
And it's also let itself grow weak and soft, right? The idea is, I think Ben's absolutely right, that the main problem really is its infection really with these, human embodied computer viruses, who are the people of North Africa and the former colonies in many cases. But also that the welfare state itself and organized labor has allowed Europeans to become lazy, in effect, and dependent on, and here we actually hear echoes of old neoliberal language. So he wants to help restore what he sees as the kind of world-conquering energy of, a Cecil Rhodes and the kind of the figures that went off and subdued the native populations in the colonies, right? By then, it's hard to get around the kind of things that was downloaded onto him as a youth in South Africa. And indeed, his association with Britain is often read through his relationship to his British roots, especially through his mother, May Musk, who was herself born in Canada, but traces her roots back to the UK. But I think that at a more functional level, so there's the ideology, but at a more functional level, his alliances with these European far-right parties is an attempt to find what I think he sees as the kind of Teslas of politics, right? The same way that 2 years before Tesla stock went vertical and eclipsed all other valuations for auto sector in general, nobody would have thought that would happen, right? Chevrolet, Ford, Toyota, these are brands that whose market dominance had been built for years. Nobody's going to suddenly switch to a newcomer. It hadn't happened, right? There hadn't been a successful new car brand in decades and decades. Tesla comes along and does it. Nobody expects it. He does it. How does he do it? He does it through memeing, right? He partially does it through owning the internet narrative. He earns it, of course, also through tapping into a desire for energy transition. But if you transpose that to these digital parties that have emerged in Europe over the last few years, whether it's Five Star or Reform UK, and you say, hey, these parties are doing something similar. They're using the affordance of the internet. They're outflanking these sclerotic, slow-moving dinosaur legacy parties of social democracy and Christian democracy. So if he can tap into their energy now and be seen as their kind of allies, once they are swept to power, he now has patron-client relationships with the new governing class in Europe. So even setting aside his far-right identitarianism, which now is impossible to deny, there would even be a kind of tactical utility to making these kind of bonds.
I mean, this is something you draw out, I think, very well, which you don't often see, or at least I don't think you see enough, which is that, look, Elon Musk has a particular relationship to the state and to government, right? He builds his companies because he wins government contracts. And that is, as you point out, pretty much a deliberate strategy from the off, is to do something like this. And this is not, we can talk about whether the ideology ever really amounted to heroic beings, but the sort of heroic entrepreneur who's going to, the Ayn Rand, off you go and create something, and government's nothing but a pure parasite on John Galt or whoever's going to design wonderful buildings, all this sort of nonsense, right? The heroic entrepreneur, he doesn't give a toss about that. He's straight off, get the government contracts, build the factory, get the money in, get the subsidies, which he does straight away, Tesla most obviously, but then SpaceX even preceding that. This is getting to the material roots of a sort of ideology, right? This is where you need to start from to understand why he's thinking what he thinks and says what he thinks, and the confused mess that it is.
Yeah, I think this returns us to a point that we really try to emphasize repeatedly throughout the book about Musk not being a libertarian, not being oriented towards the shrinking of the state, the diminution of state capacity or state sovereignty, which is how I think we often thought of what was happening to the state during the neoliberal era, but rather Muskism is about increasing state capacity through private means. But, that's not just something he plucks out of thin air. I think it does reflect some deeper political economic trends. You mentioned, for instance, the case of Tesla.
Yeah.
If you think about the renewable energy transition, obviously it interfaces with the consumer at certain points, like selling them a new type of car for their garage. But it's also a project in which you need quite a large degree of state partnership. And that's distinct from the consumer tech era of the kind that characterized Google, search engine, Facebook, social media, that if you like, certain libertarian and cyber libertarian fantasies could be more easily indulged in those political economic paradigms because, of course, there were always interactions with the state, but you didn't need to team up with the federal government, as Tesla, in fact, needs to do in 2009 to get a big loan under the banner of industrial policy, because renewable energy is, even as many of the venture capitalists investing in green capitalist firms understood at the time in Silicon Valley, has to also be a state enterprise. The same could very much be said of our current AI era. If you're going to build out a bunch of data centers, particularly against popular opposition, if you're going to secure the energy inputs required for those data centers, if you're going to further try to sell your AI products to countries around the world and deal with their various concerns around them, you're going to need a state partner. And that, I think, also helps account for the extent to which Silicon Valley's leadership class has rallied around Trump in a quite significant way. It's not simply the fear that he will discipline them as he has other private actors, but there's actually a positive reason, which is that they have a very strong motivation for a strong state partner to clear the way for them to chase AGI, as we've been discussing.
Yeah, and I think it helps to put some numbers on this just to give people a sense of the scale and, to remind viewers and listeners that this isn't just, a funny journey into the mind of one strange man, but really the infrastructure of the global economy. SpaceX emerges in 2002 as a way for the United States government to pursue what's described as network-centric warfare. So the new Rumsfeld-style military machine is no longer going to be, ideally, a lot of boots on the ground. It's going to be a small footprint of special forces operating globally with air power and, importantly, with coordination through satellite infrastructure. Musk basically pioneers low Earth orbit satellite connectivity to internet. He lowers the costs of putting mass into orbit by over 90% from the founding of Tesla up until a couple of years ago. He now has over 10,000 Starlink satellites in the sky. That's over 70% of the satellites altogether. And he has just put in an application last month to the FCC to put another 1 million satellites into low Earth orbit. So this is a reach not just for, dominant market share. This is a reach for a global telecommunications monopoly and also by extension, monopoly of the battle space of every square inch here on Earth. So that level of capacity is incredibly seductive, of course, to any government. And if the Democratic Party came to power tomorrow, they would be hard pressed to figure out how they could replace Musk in this role. If Musk dies tomorrow and Gwynne Shotwell is the head of SpaceX and she's as vile as he is, how are you going to suddenly have 10,000 different satellites up in the sky? If you expropriate SpaceX, what makes you think all of those investors aren't going to exit the company and crash it overnight in ways that make your own precarity even deeper?
I mean, you do what Donald Trump has done, which is you buy chunks of companies and you buy out whole companies. I mean, this is where the kind of the state capital fusion is starting to happen. You know, this is why you could probably get rid of Elon Musk and the thing will just carry on. Yeah.
It's an interesting scenario. Like, hopefully it'll be one that we can, not just speculate about, but think about in real lived terms. But take the two approaches that the Trump administration has taken so far to, say, advancing towards state capitalism. Part of it has been, converting, let's say, a bailout of Intel or a subsidy to Intel into a stake. So they now own shares in Intel. Alternatively, the idea that they would take some 25% of revenues from NVIDIA for its sale of top-end AI chips to China. Does that sufficiently discipline capital such that they will act in your interests all the time? I mean, the dust up with Anthropic from earlier in the Iran invasion suggests that it might not always work, right? Dario Amodei said quite forcefully that they were unwilling to allow Claude to be used in ways that would entirely remove humans from the loop for fatal targetings and to do mass surveillance. And the Pentagon responded also quite forcefully by declaring Anthropic a criminal entity effectively within the government supply chain. But how effective are they if they have to suddenly unplug something like Claude from their operating system if they don't have always a competitor waiting there, right? It's I think a sign of how this symbiosis really in its intent is to knit together infrastructures in such a way that switching costs become very high, that path dependencies become very deep and wide, and that you in a way are now forced into a negotiation which will be at the heart of government between the CEO and the head of state, with, of course, importantly, the mass of society left out of the discussion altogether.
This gets us on to the sort of final question or set of questions, which is what do we do about any of this? I mean, we touched on that, potential future government might want to nationalize Starlink. Let's put it like that. But what does the actual alternative look like to any of this? You end the book. I mean, it's one of the things that comes out quite strikingly, just as we were talking, is how bleak most of this stuff is. Like, there isn't a positive vision from Elon Musk. It's just a world of, it's like Warhammer 40,000, in the far future there is only war. It's that kind of level of like everything's just grim dark forevermore. And this starts to come through quite strongly. And you end the book with 4 different scenarios for what Muskism becomes over time. But what would a positive alternative look like? And what are the points at which you can start to argue for one and make it happen?
Well, first off, I really appreciate the Warhammer reference. Thank you for that. It's something that we don't have in the book, as you pointed out, and as readers have pointed out to us, but we've been compelled to consider a little bit more closely since the book has come out. And I think first I would answer a bit negatively, which is that I think what we're seeing now in these somewhat odd experiments with state capitalism that have been undertaken by the Trump administration is perhaps a reminder of what not to do. I think in the neoliberal era, those of us on the left thought about the state disciplining capital and the state politicizing what were presented as neutral decisions around the allocation of capital as necessarily progressive. And we're rediscovering now that they are not necessarily progressive. I mean, the kind of impulsive demand from a decade ago was nationalize Facebook, which I think maybe didn't make a ton of sense then, but participated in that kind of structure of belief about what neoliberalism was and what anti-neoliberalism was. I think the notion of a Trump administration that is attempting to expropriate the capitalist class in one form or another is actually takes us to a place that's scarier than neoliberalism, I think more dangerous. So that's a kind of, cautionary tale. In terms of what a positive response would be to Muskism, I think it's worth remembering what kind of world Muskism envisions. It envisions a world of hard borders, of fortified societies, a world in which hierarchy is the organizing principle of humanity, as segmented by race, class, gender, and nationality. And I think that's the level at which we need to propose an alternative. And the alternative, quite simply, is internationalism and universalism. And those are not necessarily abstract concepts. We've seen from the example of the people of Minneapolis how those kind of concepts can be put into practice. One of the banners of the mobilization, which defeated an incursion by ICE agents that we could describe as Muskist, essentially ethnic cleansing through high technology like facial recognition software, one of the rallying cries of the Minneapolis resistance was protect our neighbors, which sounds perhaps a bit banal, but you would be hard-pressed to find a slogan that is more antithetical to the spirit of Muskism. And I think we need to see more popular mobilizations along those lines. More practically speaking, or perhaps not more practical, but at the level of high politics in the United States, I think we also need to see a national politician making an affirmative case for more immigration. We have not had that for a long time. Bernie Sanders is actually not very good on this issue. So if you go back to Ronald Reagan, even to George W. Bush, you hear surprisingly progressive talking points, and we need that type of energy.
Maybe I'll just add what we've been thinking of as kind of the 3 R's, I think, for combating Muskism. One is, I would say, the EU model of regulation. So you kind of let dependency on Silicon Valley's products continue, but you overlay it with a bunch of new safety protocols, data privacy provisions, content moderation. That's been the approach so far. Everything's fine. Being completely interdependent is okay as long as we can add this extra layer on. The other thing would be replication. So, SpaceX isn't a problem if we can just create the British SpaceX or the European SpaceX. We can get a Spanish rocket launch happening from French Guiana, then we break the chokehold on low Earth orbit and everything's fine again. But as we know already from the attempt by doing something like Helsing AI to replace Anthropic AI, if you're not changing the relationship between user and owner, you're not changing the capital relation or really the nature of the technology at all, then you're just replicating the same problems with different actors. So we think the third is really a question of reinvention. The problem with Musk is that he's a freak. But the great thing about Musk is that there's a pedagogical value to people like that because it wakes you up, and it's having, the choke point to to the heavens being controlled by one person is extremely stark. But I think every British person, every European should think about this when they log on to Zoom, Teams, check their email, store things in Amazon Web Services. Like, it's another version of the same dependency we're describing. So the problem that it confronts us with politically is the same. And it may be the case that the kind of extraordinary overreach that's happening now by catapulting us from the software era into the AI era is actually creating political openings of the kind Ben is describing that we can hopefully capitalize on.
Ben, Quinn, thank you very much for your time and After Order.
Thank
It's
you.
my pleasure.